Hey, I know we usually prioritize theists, but Ivan was good enough to help us with the sound check, and he's been waiting for a very long time.
Absolutely. Ivan in Scotland, thank you so much for waiting. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Matt. Hi, Tracie. Hi,
Hello.
Chris. Thank you so much for having me.
Hi.
Thanks for calling.
What's up?
I just watched a bunch of your shows, and I really like your show, and I wanted to thank you for what you do. I'm an atheist, and I'm a scientist, and even though those two things sound like I'm a very reasonable person, coming from South America, as I told you before the show, you do get a lot of superstition, and of course you have friends who are religious, Catholic, or astrology, stuff like that. And your show has given me some focus to sort of dissipate this fog of superstition and sort of lift that weird thing going on and really focus on reality. So thank you very much for your show.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks.
Totally welcome. Thank you, Ivan. Is that it?
Well, the reason I was calling you is because I watched I don't know, over 100 shows of the Atheist Experience on YouTube, and you guys would have some sort of conversation with some theists, and based on the way the conversation goes, I reach a conclusion, and then you guys say something different. So I thought, oh wow, I reached a conclusion that I haven't heard you guys talk about before. So I thought I would offer you this point of view that I maybe you guys have talked about before, maybe you have said it before, but I just haven't seen it in your show yet.
Sure.
So if you look back to, thousands of years, of tens of thousands of years of human civilization, you can think of the Egyptians or the Greeks or even the cavemen during the Ice Age. We have this huge mystery, like the biggest mystery of humankind, I think, basically, which is the origin of the universe and the origin of humanity, and they would look up at the sky and look at the sun and look at the moon and look at the stars. And I think very early on, like really early on, the answer was God, like, oh, a God did it, or many gods did it. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking, what are the odds that those people who were very primitive, very ignorant compared to where we are now, they got the right answer, for the right off the bat, like for the first try, they got the right answer. What are the odds of that?
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. At first, I thought you were promoting that they did have the right answer.
I'm going to put you on hold because there's some weird noise, and we'll address this and then kind of bring you back on. So I'm going to put you back on hold. So what about this idea that, we had these big mysteries, and very early on people said, oh, well, God did it. What are the odds that they got the answer right the first time?
Right.
For me, I don't tend to argue down this line for a number of reasons. Number one, whether or not it's likely that they got the answer right the first time doesn't tell you whether or not they did or whether they had sufficient warrant for that. And when you talk to religious people about this, it's not that they just invented a God. Many of them feel that this was a revelation, that God told them or told somebody else. We can't demonstrate that, it was all made up. They have essentially propositions that we can't always demonstrate are wrong. So it almost doesn't matter how likely it is that they got the answer right the first time. I think it's far better to say that they didn't actually. We know that they couldn't have got the answer right the first time because there were so many different first answers.
Right.
Yeah. It's this spirit, it's that spirit, it's this God, it's that God. And so we know that some of them at least have to be wrong.
Yeah, and I think part of it too, though, what's interesting to me is that children go through a phase of development where they perceive agency in non-agent things. And you'll see them express that in communication when, for example, a child might shut their door and like their hand in a door, and they'll start crying and they'll say, "It bit me," right? Like when they're real small, and they perceive that these things are kind of happening on purpose. The door is bad. They might go hit the door, right? Like they're angry at the door because it's shut on their hand. And as they get older, they outgrow this idea that everything has this agency, that things are doing things on purpose. And what I find interesting is that you have a lot of religions that are animistic, where they simply endow things, non-agent things, with agency, where you basically say there's a spirit in the trees, or there's a spirit in the rocks, or there's the rivers have, spirits. And when the river overflows, it's angry. We have to do something to appease the river gods, And so you have this kind of animism that imbues everything with this agent type of spirituality. And then when you end up with the God that we've got now, this monotheistic system that is pervasive in the world in different religions, it's basically just this giant animism with the single God, where it's like everything is endowed with this agency. So it's almost like a belief from like a 3-year-old that has come into adulthood, where they're saying, there's this spirit in everything. Mm-hmm. And it's all agent, and it's all driven, and there's a purpose to everything that happens. There's a reason that the parking spaces in the front were blocked off and I couldn't park there today. And it's just interesting that it's a phase that we all go through in childhood, but most generally you outgrow it, and yet
or you think you do.
I think people are fundamentally uncomfortable with the universe just doing things. People want there to be somebody in control. I think that's one of the reasons why conspiracy theorists think the way they do.
That's
9/11 couldn't be 19 guys with box cutters.
With
it
a
had
plane.
to be It had to be something bigger, they say, right? So, people feel like they want the universe to be controlled in some way, and to not have that control makes people uncomfortable. So they invent gods and ideas.
There was a study that I talked about a while back that came out, where they had a game that was rigged, and people played this game, and you had to get these little balls in holes. And in one of the versions of the study, they just let people put the balls in the holes normally. But in another version, they magnetically controlled the balls so that they wouldn't work right. And people didn't know it, like the subjects didn't know it. And they recorded what the people said while they were playing the game, like kind of talking to themselves as they're playing the game and complaining about it not working, or how hard is this. Mm-hmm. And there were a lot more instances of agency. Yes. Communication, like terms that were like, these things just don't want to behave. They would say things that had to do with agency whenever the game was not under their control. The harder the game got to control, where it seemed like the things weren't behaving like they should. And even then I just said, they're not behaving like they can behave, and so it was just kind of an interesting thing that the more out of control people felt, the more they felt like they weren't able to control the game, the more they started to give the game agent labels.
I'm sure at home I have a box of video game controllers that I was convinced were agents, and broke them and threw them in a box. The last thing, and I'll just chime in on this, and then we'll make sure I've got a sufficient answer, is that one thing is, no matter what the first proposed answer was, no matter any appeal to agency with regard to these big mysteries, every single time we've found out what is most likely correct, what is a reasonable answer, it's never been a god. And so they're presenting these propositions that are unverifiable. And that, I think, is potentially comforting. And in some of the God proposals, the God hypotheses, the very fact that you couldn't possibly prove it wrong, or you apparently can't, may be comforting. Because if one of your big fears is not knowing what the right answer is, if you propose an answer that, even if you have to involve magic or whatever else, seems to be sufficient for that as a causal explanation for that, and it has the added benefit that it's unlikely that it could ever be proven wrong, then you end up not only feeling like you have the right answer, but you end up in exactly the same position that our Wiccan friend was in earlier, where I now have an unfalsifiable proposition and I'm justified until you prove me wrong. But I want to make sure, Ivan, was that an accurate answer for your question?
Yeah, I really liked your answer. I was wondering if I had a chance to make a last comment.
Sure.
Regarding the last caller, Daniel, you would explain something that I thought was very interesting, which is the broken calculator analogy, and I think it's very true for the viewers of your show out there. What I told you earlier, that your show gave me this focus on reality and reason. ever since I started watching your show and this, fog of superstition was lifted, I have seen the impact of that in other aspects of my life when using, using reason and things that are not subjective, So again, thank you very much for your show.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
People.
We really appreciate it. Thank you, Ivan.
I like what
Thank you.
Ivan was saying there about the inability to actually see the impact of the irrational beliefs until you start to withdraw from them. And I think for a lot of people who lost religion, who are atheists with religious histories, you do start to see it takes sometimes, I know that I still worry that there are parts of my life that are still somehow impacted by the irrationality of what I was taught. And there were the first few years after my deconversion, there were so many things that I realized I was so biased about because it was what I had been taught. And you think to yourself, well, I'll get rid of this belief in the religion, I get rid of this belief in God, and then all of this just falls away. But it doesn't just fall away. You still go forward realizing like how sexist you were, taught, and how anti, like homophobic you were taught. And
I think the two biggest ones that I hear
awful.
from everybody, that even after being out of religions for years, particularly people who were involved in Christianity, Islam, major religions, there's still baggage that affects how they view other people, and there's lots of baggage about sex.
Oh gosh, yeah.
And it's
so much judgment on
this is
people.
why when I hear something like this, oh well, you haven't demonstrated it's harming anybody. What does it hurt if so and so believes that there's a God? Well, I think we can demonstrate quite a bit of harm that is directly due to beliefs and encouraging those beliefs in others.
Yeah. But like he's saying, there's so many tentacles to it.
Yeah.
So it is like it's not just. I mean, you gave the example of a broken calculator, but what if that 3 key is broken, and everything you do with that 3 key is going to be wrong as a result, and you don't even realize it? Like, what if you don't even know the 3 key is broken?
Yeah,
and you're
because
just
the first
trusting
couple
the
times you did
calculator.
it,
You
hey.
can't know how deep it goes and what other things it can be affecting until you start extracting it.
And this is why I keep talking about, do you believe whether or not things are true? Are you willing to take the sort of detailed inventory of your lives, of your beliefs, of the things that you are convinced of, with the integrity, the intellectual honesty to say, hey, maybe I don't have good reason for that. But if this belief is so meaningful to you and it's cherished, instead of sitting here saying, okay, well, I'm unreasonable about that, but I'm going to keep believing it, why wouldn't you strive to go out and find out and attempt to verify it? Because if it's so meaningful and you could be the one who could verify it in such a way that it would be useful to others, why aren't you doing it?
Yeah.
To me, it sounds like an exercise in intentional self-deception. It's like somewhere you're like, oh, I'm terrified to find out I might be wrong, so I'm just going to keep believing it until somebody proves me wrong, rather than caring enough to see if it proves you right. It reminds me of like the faith healers. If they could do what they claim they could do, why the hell are they running around speaking to church groups and taking up love offerings instead of going to hospitals and curing everybody?
Right.
I mean, because if you do that, all of a sudden we find out that you're a charlatan. I mean, and then, if I'm wrong, prove me wrong. But that's what we do. When we put things to the test, every single time we put things to robust tests, we find no evidence of the phenomenon. This is what the JREF did for years with the $1 Million Prize.
When I started to ask myself exactly what is it that I'm claiming I believe, and exactly why do I believe this? Like, what is making me convinced of this? That was when it just became a search to get to the end where it was just like, there's nothing there.
And I remember you gave an interesting analogy in the film where you talk about how it was like a surprise ending in a movie.
Yeah.
And can you just tell that story?
Well, it's what I just said before, that you get to the end and it's not what you thought it was, and suddenly you start going back. You almost want to go back and watch the movie again because now everything takes on a different cast. And that's what I was saying about the tentacles. You go back and you say, oh my gosh, there was this situation that I attributed to God, and now I'm looking back at it going, why on earth did I attribute that to God? Like, it was such a mundane, nothing thing, or maybe it was a unique or rare thing, but it's something that certainly happens. Like the one time we had a caller that was saying something about, rare cures for people and how that, like, remissions were miracles from God. And I said, when you have, like, a study where you're using rats and a rat goes into remission, is that a miracle from God? And he was like, well, no, of course not. I'm like, okay, what can you say?
Rats don't count.
Yeah.